Well, first, I actually haven't been president of EMPACT America for a couple of years. Now I'm the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, which is a congressional advisory board on these issues. We work for the Congressional EMP Caucus. And before that, I worked on the House Armed Services Committee, and before that, the CIA. And I've spent all of my professional life working on weapons of mass destruction, including EMP. And this is the one that has always concerned me the most, because it is the least understood, and it can do the most damage with the smallest investment. But let me talk about some of the good news here, because I think everybody already knows about the threat and how catastrophic it would be. But one of the things that makes this so tragic is there's really no excuse for the country to be vulnerable to EMP. We have known for decades, how to protect military systems against it, and it's far easier to protect the civilian grid against it. There are things like Faraday cages and surge arresters that can be used. The heart of the grid is these EHV, extremely high voltage transformers. They are to our civilization what the aqueducts were to the Romans. You can't have a grid and you can't have a modern society without these EHV transformers. They aren't built in this country anymore. They were invented here by Nikola Tesla, and they were originally built here. We exported the electric grid to the world. But unfortunately, like so many things, we don't make it here anymore. There's only 2 countries in the world that make EHV transformers for export, South Korea and Germany. And the worldwide production of EHV transformers is 180 per year, because the windings have to be done by hand, the old-fashioned way, just the way Nikola Tesla did them. And we have about 3,000 EHV transformers in this country. So it doesn't take a genius, to do the arithmetic that if you lose 1,000 DHV transformers, how many years will it take? And it doesn't take a year for people to starve to death massively, which is why the Commission estimated that, that within a year, given our current state of unpreparedness of a nuclear or natural EMP, because the sun can do this too, by means of a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection. And that is an actual photograph taken from our SOHO satellite, December 2012, when we entered the solar maximum of our Carrington-class coronal mass ejection. You may not be able to see it, but this little blue dot is the relative size of the Earth compared to one of these coronal mass ejections. And so you don't need to be an astrophysicist to understand that if this hits that, it's going to ruin your whole day. A Carrington event could be even worse than a super EMP weapon, because it would cause an EMP worldwide and collapse electric grids everywhere. But yet again, the technology is understood. It's relatively inexpensive. The highest estimate that we've got is about $2 billion to protect the whole country. And as we've looked at different plans, we've been able to bring the price down so that it's down now around $500 million, according to some plans. And there are 3 plans. There are many ways of doing it. There's 3 plans described in the book about how to protect the country, but we can't get people. We haven't been able to get the Congress to do it. I actually was going to be selfish in coming here today, because have this audience be sort of a therapist for me, because I'm extremely alarmed at what is not being reported in our news. And while it's fascinating to talk about the future, I frankly am increasingly concerned that we may not have any future, given how blind we are about what's going on and what isn't being talked about. I mean, it's appalling to me that here, the whole focus of the media reporting and what we're focused on in this town today, is over sequestration, over the budget, whether the government is going to shut down tomorrow. Let me talk about just 3 things going back, I guess, 4 weeks ago, over the past 4 weeks, things that have happened that I find extremely disturbing, but that weren't reported or were barely reported in the press. I think it was the 2nd of September on a Monday when Israel did that unannounced anti-missile test. It's all over the Russian press, but to my knowledge, not mentioned at all, except in one article I wrote for Lignet, that the Russians had the General Staff Command Post went on alert in response to that and notified Vladimir Putin that unknown missiles were coming out of the Med, headed towards Syria, where they have a fleet. Now, they likened this, their Deputy Defense Minister likened this to the January 1995 incident. They did this, not me, which was the closest we ever came to a nuclear war. And they reminded, that they told an international press that on the 25th of January 1995, when they had detected a an unannounced Norwegian meteorological rocket. You know, they had nearly pushed the button over that, you know, because they had not been notified. And they likened this thing that happened back in September to the January 1995 incident, which was the closest we ever came. It's the only time to all three Chegets, which is the nuclear, their equivalent of the nuclear football, the presidential football, except 3 people can launch nuclear strikes in Russia, as opposed to only the president here. You know, the chief of the general staff, the defense minister, and the president. All 3 of those Chegets were activated, and basically Kalashnikov, the chief of the general staff, was yelling at Yeltsin, who was the president at the time, to push the button. And it was only Boris Yeltsin, an alcoholic, you know, who couldn't believe the United States was going to launch a surprise nuclear attack out of the blue. He waited, he paused, you know, the 10 minutes, and that's what spared us. That's how close we came. And they claimed on 2nd of September that because of what the Israelis did, that this was another incident, a nuclear war scare. You'd be surprised at how long it takes to set up that red phone. You know, it takes a day. You know, yeah, it takes a day. You can't actually pick up the red phone, and, you know, there's a whole State Department bureaucracy involved with the red phone.
It has to be a red cell phone these days.
Yeah, right. The other thing that another event, well, another fact is that Russian fleet that nobody seems to think much of, you know. I mean, the Russians are closely allied with Syria. They've made it clear that their national interests are tied up in there. There are probably tactical nuclear weapons on that Russian fleet. Where do people think these 8,000 tactical nuclear weapons the Russians have are? In storage? You know, we know from their exercises, their military writings, that these things play a very important role in their defense plans. You know, the Moskva, which is now the flagship of the Russian fleet in Syria, you know, during the Cold War, we understood that that thing carried tactical nuclear weapons that had yields of 300 kilotons, you know, on anti-ship missiles. So, you know, that Russian fleet has probably got tactical nuclear weapons on it. The whole thing strikes me as like 1914 all over again, where where the president passed the buck to Congress. Now, and the Congress and the president, now that we're engaged in negotiations, our fleet is still there. We've passed the buck to our guys and to the Russian fleet as well, who are going to be watching each other because they have no alternative with their national technical means, like Hawks, just in case something should happen. What if there's some kind of a glitch with a satellite? What if the Hezbollah or Iran or somebody who would love to see the United States and Russia get into a nuclear war with each other decides to use cyber warfare to try to convince, or they're small, you know, the Iranians have got anti-silk missiles from China, they've got sunburn missiles from the Russians, you know, to attack our guys and start a war, like 1914. You've got all these actors, many of whom have an interest in seeing us go to war with each other. Let me just step through a couple of other headlines that should have been, that things that have happened over the past few weeks that have really bothered me, that our own Western media has largely ignored them. After Obama struck the great deal with Putin, and they went into negotiations, Syria had crossed the chemical red line, but now they're going to go into negotiations.
Pink line. It was only a pink line.
Pink line, right. North Korea started the Yongbyon reactor, and that has gone virtually unreported, which is crossing another red line. That was supposed to be a red line with North Korea, that they were not going to restart that reactor, but they did. And not even Fox News has mentioned it. You know, that produces enough plutonium for 2 atomic bombs a year. On Friday, Maritz, an Israeli newspaper, reported that based on interviews with experts, Israeli experts, who have elected to remain anonymous, they believe that the red line in Iran has already been crossed, and that it is too late to stop Iran from getting them, that Iran has probably already developed at least one nuclear weapon. And I think that is so. Congressman Bartlett and I, 2 years ago, you know, wrote an article in the Washington Times pointing out, and it just kind of, it does astonish me that we have this, you know, we truly are a culture of strategic optimists, you know. I mean, here's a country that's had a nuclear weapons program for 30 years, and supposedly in 30 years they haven't been able to build an atomic bomb. When the United States in World War II, in the Manhattan Project, working with 1930s and 1940s era technology, built 2 atomic bombs of completely different design in just 3 years. You know, and the Iranians have had the help from North Korea, the Russians, the Chinese, and yet they still supposedly, well, there's still a year before they're going to get the bomb. Why do we think that? Because the Iranians have told the IAEA inspectors, supposedly, exactly how many centrifuges they really have, and based on our calculations. But if you pull all of this together, the EMP, the cyber warfare, the doctrine, the adversary doctrine, which among the Russians, the Chinese, North Korean, to them, cyber warfare, information warfare, is not just computer viruses, but it includes kinetic attacks, like those AK-47s that were used in San Jose, all the way up to nuclear EMP attack. And it's almost like over the past several years, we've seen a dry run happening, where all of these things have happened. They've been attacking us, maybe not doing everything that they could. I think that these things are more like exploratory scouting expeditions to see how vulnerable, our critical infrastructures really are with their viruses and those kinds of attacks. Now we've had a couple of instances where we've had kinetic attacks on transformers. The San Jose one, clearly professionally. They haven't found those so-called vandals. We don't know who they were, and they were using AK-47s when they did it. And the last part, well, where's the EMP in this? And that, not just theoretical. That North Korean freighter that was stopped for smuggling drugs into Panama, had SA-2 missiles on it. That is a nuclear-capable surface-to-air missile. The Russians designed it so that it could carry a nuclear warhead. Now, it didn't have a nuclear warhead on it, but it's just fascinating that just by accident, because they were investigating that thing for smuggling drugs, that we found that here's a North Korean vessel that had a nuclear-capable missile, in the Caribbean, which was the EMP Commission's nightmare scenario. Our worst-case scenario was that Iran or North Korea or somebody, would put a short-range missile or some kind of a missile on a freighter and do an EMP attack on a freighter and hit it, launch it up over the east coast of the United States. And here we've actually found a freighter that had a nuclear-capable missile in it just by accident when it was trying to go through the Panama Canal. How many other things have been going on like that? So you've got all the building blocks here. I wonder how much time we have. I wonder how much time, It's just the complexity of our world now and all the different pathways in which things could lead to an apocalypse. 99 years ago, this August just passed, World War I started because the political military leaders at the time were overwhelmed by the technology of the time. The technology involved in the act of mobilizing armies, was something they didn't anticipate, the complexity of it, the risks of trying to de-escalate that once mobilization had started. And so all it took was one bullet from a Serbian terrorist to set us down a path that the great minds of the time, the political military leaders and the crowned heads of Europe could not control. How much more complex is the technology and the difference between war and peace today? Then the decision between war and peace was based on days and weeks.
Right.
Now it's minutes and seconds. And extremely potentially fallible and cyber vulnerable satellite systems and early warning systems and all kinds of bad guys out there who would love to see an apocalypse that would take out the United States and Russia both. Just one last thing I want to mention. Thursday, the Russians finished Zapad 13, which is a big military exercise that they held. Again, another thing that hasn't gone mentioned while they're negotiating with us on behalf of the Syrians. And this exercise, by the way, was witnessed by President Putin and Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. It was a joint exercise between Russia and Belarus that in a matter of a couple of days delivered 22,000 troops from central Russia to the gates of Poland and the Baltic states. So just another thing that, that the Western press seems to have no interest in whatsoever and might cast a certain perhaps raise some questions about the sincerity of our Russian negotiating partners in Syria and the like. Anyway, thank you for letting me get all those events off my chest.